Go ahead and turn to Revelation 12. Again, I feel like I've been saying this for the last few weeks, but this is one of the most difficult sections of the book, and it's also one of the most important sections of the book. Chapters 10 through 13 are part of an interlude, and chapters 12 through 15 really are another section. Some commentators on the book of Revelation will say that this chapters 12 through 15 is in fact the central or most important part of the entirety of the book. Now, whenever you look at chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, what you're going to notice is that we have the same story all over again. Remember last week when we went through chapters 10 and 11, and what we noticed there was that it was really the same story we've been looking at the whole time. Y'all remember that? That we have a lot of bad stuff happening in the world, but God's still in control. God's people suffer. Many of them are martyred. But eventually, the faithful are going to be raised to be with God forever. That was chapters 10 and 11. It's also Revelation chapter 4, 5, and 6. And it's also chapters 7 and 8, and chapter 9. It's chapters 10 and 11. Well, guess what? It's chapters 12 and 13 too. Are y'all excited? So we get, again, another scene or another episode. If you can begin to look at it like episodes from your favorite sitcom, The Andy Griffith Show, or Perry Mason. I watched Perry Mason one summer when I was younger, and I realized it's really the same story, the same structure every time. Have y'all noticed that? I mean, it's predictable by the clock. You can tell what's about to happen. It's the same thing, just different stuff plugged in. Well, this is what Revelation does. We have the same scene several times. Chapter 12 is again the beginning of another one of these episodes in which we have the same scene all over again. Now, I want you to look here at chapter 12 through chapter 15 as one literary section. And this one literary section, you, coincidentally, have 7 sections. And these 7 sections are divided by John by these sayings, and I saw, or behold. So if you'll look through chapter 12 through 15, you'll see these words 7 times. I saw, or behold. Okay, depending on your translation. You'll see that phrase 7 times. And each one of those 7 times we advance in this episode. Just like you're going around the clock in Perry Mason, with these and I saw or behold phrases, you advance in the episode. Now here's the way it works. The first thing that you see here in chapter 12 is the conflict with the serpent and with the woman and her seed. In chapter 13, you have the persecution by the beast from the sea, the persecution from the beast from the land, the Lamb and the 144,000 standing on Zion in chapter 14, the proclamation of the gospel and the judgment by 3 angels in 14, the Son of Man's harvest in chapter 14, and then the saints' victory over the sea beast and the victory song in chapter 15 down through verse 4. So, I know I went through that really quick. I just want you to see the structure, that we're getting the same message, but it is a separate episode or a separate scene, if you will. So, what we're looking at is the same story, but with different perspectives. The same story, but with different details. Okay? Now, perhaps one of the most helpful things that we can see here, beginning in chapter 12, is to sort of get ourselves acclimated to what's going on. So we're going to have here in chapter 12 this struggle between a woman and a dragon. But it's not really the woman so much as it is the son that she has. Now, if we'll begin there, then I think the rest of it's going to make a lot more sense. The son is obviously Jesus. No one really debates that. No one really disputes that. The son that is born is Christ. The woman who gives birth to the son, while there may be some emphasis on Eve, is probably talking to us about the nation of Israel itself. Israel is often described as a woman, the bride of Christ, even in the Old Testament, or the wife of God, more specifically. But you have this woman, Israel, that is giving birth to this son that is God, the healer, the Savior. And then you see the struggle that God's people have after Jesus comes into the world until eventually all are brought home to glory. Okay? Now that's what's going to happen here in chapter 12. Was that a lot easier than what we're about to get into in chapter 12? Maybe. All right. But let's look here in chapter 12 so that we can see this same episode. Okay? Same story. You don't get tired of watching the Andy Griffith Show, do you? You don't get tired of watching Perry Mason. All right. So we're not tired of Revelation, even though it's the same thing from different perspectives. So let's look here in chapter 12. John says, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was pregnant and crying out in birth pains with the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems, and his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. And she gave birth to a male child." Then look at the description. "One who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to His throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. All right. A lot of weird stuff going on here. But where our anchor is in this child, this male child who is born, who is going to rule with a rod of iron. He's going to be the Savior. He's the one that is, by all commentators, recognized to be Jesus. This is our Savior who is born to the nation of Israel, or from Israel. They produced Jesus. And then, go back to Matthew and Mark and Luke. What happens as soon as Jesus is born? What happens? Right? We have the slaughter of the innocents, and Jesus, with His family, flees to Egypt so that it might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I have called my son, all the way back from the Old Testament, right? And so He goes to Egypt until this danger is past, and then they are able to go back home. So what we have described here is that event, or that series of events, from a spiritual perspective. What's really going on behind the scenes? First of all, we go back here to verse 1. And John wants us to see this woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, this is, I think, clearly looking to Jesus, especially, or to the nation of Israel, right, the Israelites, especially as we have this crown of 12 stars. Going back to Genesis 37 and verse 9, these are typical ways of describing the people of Israel. We also see that Song of Solomon 6 and verse 10, where the writer there says, "Who is this who looks down from the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners?" The Israelites and Jewish interpreters understood the Song of Solomon to be a story of God's love for His people. And so this particular description here of Song of Solomon, chapter, Song of Solomon, chapter 6 and verse 10, is a description then of God's people. It sounds a whole lot like what we have here in Revelation 12, describing Israel. So what we have here then is Israel, through whom Jesus is born. This is the first thing that we need to see. But then in verse 3, we see another sign, another thing that we need to see. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon. So this is a spiritual view of a great red dragon. Well, whenever you look at this idea of a dragon or a serpent, any type of serpent or dragon in the Bible is a reference to the devil himself. Okay? So in Genesis 3, we are introduced to the Satan, to the devil, and how is he making himself to appear? He's a serpent, right? He is a serpent. That theme runs all the way throughout the Old Testament. The snakes are bad. It don't matter if they're in a garden. It don't matter if they're in a tree talking to you. It don't matter if they're in Egypt and have to be defeated. It doesn't matter if they are giant sea creatures. The serpents are always bad and in some way are associated with the devil himself. Okay? So whenever you read of Leviathan, you don't need to try and figure out which dinosaur that was. Okay? That's just wrong. That's the wrong way to read it. It's just a way of describing this manifestation of the devil. Okay? We good? Now, I don't have trouble with that because I think all snakes are bad. I don't like none of them. Anytime I see a snake, you know what I think? Devil. Bad. Go away. All right? So anytime in the Bible you see a serpent of any sort, if it's a giant sea creature or if it's this dragon, which is the serpent, okay, same concept, then what you're reading about is the devil. So here we have the great red dragon. This is just another way of talking to us about the devil. He has 7 heads and 10 horns. Notice that this is a way that we might expect God to be described, because we have 7 and 10, right? Because these numbers are supposed to represent God, because they represent completeness. But here we have a competitor to God, one who would set himself up to be God. Who is it? It's the devil. And he is complete in his work, so he is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns, or 10, is that right? Yeah, 7 heads and 10 horns here with 7 diadems. Okay? But this is just a way of showing us that the devil is real, the devil is active, and he is trying to replace God. Here in verse 4, his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them down to the earth. This is typical apocalyptic imagery showing social upheaval, that the devil is working and is causing problems. That's all we need to understand there. The dragon stood before the woman, stood before Israel, who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. Now, how did the devil do that? Through Herod. Right? Now, this is an important principle, because as you're reading here, you're going to see things happening, but the devil's always behind the scenes. Whenever we look at the beast coming from the water, the beast coming from the land, all this struggle, don't get distracted with that. It's really the devil that we're dealing with. He's the one that's behind everything. He's the one that's really active. Okay? Sort of like when you ever get brain freeze when you eat too much ice cream? Has that ever happened to you? And it's never happened to me because I've never had too much ice cream too fast. But I've heard about this. The problem is not a headache, is it? The problem is that you're eating too much ice cream and those particular nerve receptors don't know how to deal with that, and so they send a shot of pain up to your brain so that you stop what you're doing. So you don't really have a headache. It's really something else going on, right? When we're looking here in this apocalyptic imagery, we're looking at the devil working through people on the earth. And here he's working through Herod to execute the child. All right. So she gave birth to the male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And eventually that's what happens, isn't it? All right? And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. Where have we seen these numbers before? In the last series that we looked at last week, right? And we determined, or at least I suggested to you, that these 1,260 days, 3.5 years, refers to the entirety of the Christian age, with an emphasis on the persecution that Christians have to endure. That's why it's presented as small or incomplete. 3.5 rather than 7. Okay? So then we have this persecution, this time of trial, that is the Christian life. It never goes away until glory. It never goes away until heaven. So, the church is nourished. The church is cared for during this time of trial. In verse 7, all right, let's stop right there. Any questions or anything? If you can get the first 6 verses, you're good on the rest of it. Anything? Okay. Well, let's go on here, verse 7. A war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. Now, this is not as strange as a theme or a scene as we might expect. You see Michael and the devil fighting over the body of Moses in Jude and 2 Peter. You also see it in writings of the Jews in between the Testaments, and so this is not anything new. You also see angels of God fighting, presumably with the angels of the devil, in the latter half of Daniel. Not something we talk about very much, but it's there. And so again, we see this very real spiritual struggle that is presented to us all the way down through verse 8. It culminates here in verse 9 as the devil, the great dragon, was thrown down. Look at how he's described. He's the great dragon, the ancient serpent, called the devil and the Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Who's the great dragon? He's the serpent. You see how all of this imagery from Genesis on culminates in Revelation. Right? It's the apex of all the Old Testament prophecies. So he's the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And what's he doing? He's going to and fro on the earth. He's walking around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. How long does this go on? For the 1,260 days, which is also the 1,000 years, the entirety of the Christian age. It's going on forever until Jesus returns, and it's going on in our lives right now. This is what's happening. This is the struggle that we are in. So, in verse 10, he says, "And I heard with a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of His Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." Now, this is bookending Jesus' ascension. Right? Notice that verse 10 sounds a lot like hymns of praise for an enthroned king. Jesus is victorious. He's reigning in heaven. But what's also happening? The devil has been restrained. He's been thrown down. He's going to continue to persecute God's people. He's going to continue to cause mischief because that's just who he is. But guess what? We look here in verse 10 and we see the sovereign authority of Jesus as He is yet reigning. And he says here in verse 11 that they have conquered Him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. These are God's people. We conquer the devil through what Jesus has done. And through, notice that it's interestingly coupled here, through what Jesus has done, His sacrificial work, and through the faith that we continue to believe and preach and practice. The word of His testimony. He says that they have conquered because they love not their lives even to the point of death. Talking specifically about martyrs here, I think. That they believed in the Lord and were willing to give their lives because they believed in the Lord. He says, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell on them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, for he knows his time is short." Notice here the geographic, as it were, descriptions of these two groups. You have those that dwell in heaven, and then you have the earth dwellers, and then the sea. So you have God's people, these are the heavenly ones, and then you have the earth dwellers, which we've already noted are just those that are outside of Christ. Those that are in the sea, again, is a representation of spiritual evil. The Jews believed that the demons lived in bodies of water. That's why you see the demons wanting to go in the pigs, and where do they go? They don't go to Piggly Wiggly. They go right straight into the water, right? Because that's where home is. They go home to the sea. All right? So we have spiritual evil, people that are following these evil practices, the earth dwellers. They're all still yet afflicting God's people, but they will themselves be afflicted. So verse 13, "When the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child." So the devil is persecuting God's people. He's pursuing the woman who had given birth to the child. He is persecuting God's people. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, into the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and a half time. Or 3.5 years, or how many days is that about? Take a wild guess. About 1,260 days. Right? So, what time are we talking about? Through the persecution. What's going to happen? It's going to be real persecution, but guess what? God's taking care of you. God is taking care of you. We might see special significance here to how the Christians, reading Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, the Olivet Discourse, remembering that Jesus had told them that when you see the abomination of desolation standing in this place, you need to get out of here. Whenever Titus and his armies had laid siege to Rome for about 3 years, and then to Jerusalem, laid siege to Jerusalem for about 3 years, and then finally destroyed it in AD 70 so that he could get back home and take care of some stuff, the Christians fled. And they were not put to death like the Jews. How did they know? Because they had Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. They knew that Jesus had told them that Jerusalem would be destroyed. So they got out of there, and they did not suffer like the Jews who remained in Jerusalem. Now this sounds oddly similar to that situation to me. Okay? So perhaps there is an emphasis to that, but the principle holds true throughout all of life. We don't have to be a part of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. We go through similar things all the time, don't we? And God carries us through. So in verse 15, the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. So you have that thing, then you've got another persecution. But the earth came to help the woman, and the earth opened up its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from its mouth, in verse 16. Now, we are tempted, I think, to try and find out exactly what's going on here. My advice to you is to do what I do. Don't do that. Because you could spend the rest of your life trying to figure out exactly what that is and never really be sure. Okay? So, here's what I do. I don't do that, but I see the principle. What's being communicated? No matter what the devil is doing, God provides a way. It's going to be different each time, but God provides a way through the difficulty. God takes care of His people. That's the message that we need to see. So, in verse 17, the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So we have different persecutions described, but it's the same principle. Persecution after persecution after persecution. What's God going to do? He's going to deliver. What's the devil going to do? He's going to persecute. Okay? Those things will always be true. All right. When we get here to verse 17, it leads us into chapter 13, part of the same episode, part of the same theme. So there in verse 1, John says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head." This beast rising out of the sea with the 10 horns and 7 heads is a pretty typical way of describing Rome as it sort of emerged, right? But then you have these 10 horns, 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on its 10 diadems on its head. Yeah, okay. I put my glasses back on. Okay, so what is going on here is that we see the devil working through the government at that time and through all political structures perhaps to afflict God's people. Notice that here in chapter 13 we have a similar description to the devil's tool that we see in chapter 12. Right? See that? You see the similarities there in the way they're described? But the main thing is that again, the devil is working through this particular power. Okay? In verse 2, he says, "The beast that I saw was like a leopard, and its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth." Now this will make you think about Daniel's visions, won't it? Right? Now where did they all culminate? All these visions of animals like this culminate in Rome. What are the Christians struggling with here? They're struggling with the persecution the devil is bringing about through Rome. Now this happens in a couple of different ways, but the government itself is concerned because in order for the government to function, all of its citizens have to take part in the emperor worship. That's just the way it works. Okay? So in chapters 13 and 14, you have described for you this relationship between the Roman government and the Roman empirical cultus, it's called. The emperor worship. Okay? So, as we look at that, it's interesting to note that Caesar was to be described as Lord God and Savior. He called himself the Son of God. He demanded to be worshipped. He put his image on coins and everywhere else and demanded that everyone treat those as being worshipped and that he himself was a god. He called himself the very same things that Jesus calls himself. And in order to keep the peace, he demands that everyone falls in line with this particular pagan system. Okay? Now, in order to function in society in Rome, what do you have to do? You have to worship the Roman deities, which includes what? It includes the emperors. It includes all of these great heroes. So when we look here in chapters 13 and 14, with the first beast, perhaps we have an emphasis on the government itself. And with the second beast, with chapter 14, we have an emphasis upon the false religion that is enforcing the government. Okay? Chapter 13, first beast, the government that's persecuting Christians. Chapter 14, the second beast, it is the Roman empirical cultus that is persecuting Christians. But those two things are very closely intertwined. Okay? You can't really have one without the other. Is that making sense? Y'all following what I'm saying here? You've got these two things that go together to persecute Christians. You have the devil working through the government. You have the devil working through Roman empirical worship. These two things come together to persecute God's people. All right? Now that's not so foreign an idea to us, I don't think. Especially as we live in our current world with different things going on. You have things that are being done either by the government or by the culture at large. Right? Same setup. Same setup. If we were in China, then atheism is the national religion, as it were. The government enforces that, right? And so these two beasts would fit perfectly with that system, wouldn't they? You have the government and the theology, the religion that is enforced by the government and backs up the government. Both of these things together persecute Christians. But it's really the devil the whole time. Okay? All right. Well, let's go on just for a second to verse 3. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. Now, this is another reason why we think that this is talking specifically about the Roman government. Nero, who you can remember as a crazy, wicked person, eventually died. But in Domitian's day, he also was a crazy, wicked guy. And so they thought that Nero had been raised from the dead. All right? I'm going to try and tell you what it's called in Latin. The Nero Revisivus myth. I just like to say it. But it's the Nero was revived myth. That Nero was born again in Domitian. What's being described here in verse 3 is that Nero has risen from the dead, and we call him Domitian. Same sort of persecution, same sort of trial, and both demanded to be worshipped. And they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" Notice the people are worshiping two things. They're worshiping the devil, and they're worshiping these emperors. This is the Roman government with its Roman empirical cultus, its Roman empirical worship. Okay? All right, we good? Any questions or anything? Yes, sir, Mark? The Jews were given special privileges. They stand out amongst all the other conquered peoples. It's not really clear as to why, except providentially that they are not required to participate in the Roman cultus. The Christians very early on are seen by the Romans as being part of the Jewish community. They're just another Jewish offset. But as those distinctions become much more clear to the world, to the Romans, then the Christians lose this Jewish protection, right? And as they lose that Jewish protection, then they are expected, both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, they are expected to participate in the emperor worship in the pagan cultus. Something of a superstition, especially as they look at it as a competitor, since... Yeah. The Romans are going to see, especially the claims of Jesus, as being anti-empirical because Jesus has the same names that Caesar claimed for himself. Yeah. All right. I think that's more than enough for today. What do y'all think? That be good? All right. Well, let's be dismissed, and then